Now let's add validation to this form. So in the last section, when we were building template-driven forms, we added validation using HTML5 attributes. So we had required, min length, max length, and pattern. Now, when building reactive forms, we don't use HTML5 attributes here. We assign validators when creating form control objects. So let me delete this here. Let's go to our component. So here in our component, we assign one or more validators when creating form control objects. So look at the constructor of the form control class. The first parameter here, which is optional as indicated by this question mark, is the form state, which is basically the initial value we set to this form control. Now here we can set an empty string because we don't need an initial value. Now look at the second parameter. It's validator. And once again, this is optional, as you can see with this question mark here. Now look at the type of this validator. It's either a validator fn, which basically means a validator function, or, so this vertical line in TypeScript means or it can be an array of validator functions. So what are these validator functions? Well, in Angular, we have a class called validators. And this class is defined in Angular/forms. So we can import it here using the auto import plugin, or on the top, where we're importing the form group and form control classes, we can also add validators. So all the validators we have in our template-driven forms, they exist here as well. These validators are methods defined in this class. So here we have a method called required. We have another method called min length. We have max length. We have pattern and email. Now note that I'm accessing these methods directly using the validators class. So I'm not creating a new instance of this class in order to access these methods. In TypeScript and also a lot of object-oriented programming languages, we call these kind of members, these kind of methods as static members. So when a method is defined as static using the static keyword, it can be accessed directly using the class name. We don't need to create an instance of the class in order to access that method. And this basically simplifies accessing methods or other members of a class. Okay, so here I want to make this username required. So I'm going to use the required method. Now note that I'm not calling this method here. I'm simply passing a reference to this function because the second argument for the constructor of form control requires a validator function, which is basically a function reference. Okay, so this is how we assign a validator to a form control object. Now we can use the same approach with the password field. So we set the initial value to an empty string and pass validators.required. Now let's go to our template and add validation error messages. So back here. So here's our input field. Right after this, we're going to add a div for displaying the validation errors. So a div with the class alert and alert danger. And the error is username is required. Exactly like what we did when building template-driven forms. Now we want to render this div only if this field is touched and invalid. So ng if. Now in the last section, we defined a template variable like username and set it to ng model. And with this, we got access to this ng model directive. And from there, we could check to see if this field is touched and invalid or not. When building reactive forms, this approach doesn't work because here we have not applied the ng model directive. So instead, we need to get access to the underlying form control object that we created in our component. So let me delete these two lines. Back in our component. So here we have a field called form. And you know that in our templates, we can access these fields directly, right? So back in the template, here in ngIf, we can type form. Now this form object, which is an instance of the form group class, has a method called get. And from here, we can get access to any form control objects inside this group. So we pass the name here, username, and this gives us access to the username form control object. And from here, we can access this touched property. And then similarly, we type form.get username dot invalid. Now this code looks a little bit lengthy, and I'm going to show you how to fix this problem in just a second. Let's make sure the application is working up to this point. So if the username field is touched and is invalid, we render the validation error. So back in the browser, so I put the focus here, tab away, we get the validation error. But if I go back here and type something, the validation error is gone. Beautiful. Now, how do we clean up this noisy code? Well, let's go back to our component. Here we can define a property that gives us access to this username form control object. So remember properties, they look like fields from the outside, but internally they're kind of like methods. So here we define a getter and call this username. It's like a method. And in the body of this method or this property, we return this.form.get username. Now we can access this property in our template. And with this, we don't have to repeat this expression twice. So back in the template, I'm going to replace form.getUsername with the username property in our TypeScript class. And one more time, username. So to add validation to our reactive forms, we assign one or more validator functions when creating a form control object. And then in the template, we use a div to render validation error messages exactly like what we did in the last section.